Well, I want to thank everyone at Omega Diagnostics for this opportunity to give you an abbreviated perspective of some of the things I've been working on related to the HPA axis and stress. So this is sort of a brief overview. I'm from the US. I've been in the functional medicine, dietary supplement world here in the US for the last almost 25, 26 years, and the founder and director of the Point Institute. And I've been particularly focusing on this issue really for the last almost 15 years or so. So one of the things that I've been challenging within this community is this notion that stress has become all about the adrenal gland or the adrenals. And so here we often talk about, I need to test your adrenals, or we talk about adrenal fatigue. And so I'm going to kind of challenge that idea and really get us to think that the adrenal gland obviously is part of the HPA axis, but stress is really not really a adrenal phenomena per se. So when I say to people that we need to stop using this idea, I say partly the idea of that the adrenals are stress is an oversimplified idea, and in some ways mostly wrong. And then it really limits our leverage of the real solution. So the reason I say it's oversimplified is if we think of adrenal function or dysfunction, it's rarely the defining feature or root cause of stress, of a stress response system dysfunction. Even though you might be measuring cortisol, as you are, which is an adrenal hormone, it isn't really the driving force for why the HPA axis is changing. So it's really an oversimplification and misses the root cause, which is usually going on in the brain. And then because of that, it's under leveraged because if we want to give therapies, oftentimes we think, well, I want to support the adrenals. And if we're thinking of supporting the adrenal gland and not understanding that there are other factors, and a lot of other factors that you need to deal with, for which the brain is changing the HPA axis stress response, then you're really missing and those, because you're overlooking what's really happening and you're not leveraging them. So one of my missions is to really get clinicians and hopefully patients to think of stress in the HPA axis phenomena rather than just the adrenals. And you should know that even the term adrenal fatigue is really kind of taken a sour note, let's say. Here in the United States, the Hormone Foundation Endocrine Society is actually even putting out on their website and documentation sort of warning people that using the term adrenal fatigue, or clinicians that are using the term adrenal fatigue, maybe misdiagnosing you, it's not a real phenomena, and that it could even be dangerous if you treat adrenal fatigue. Obviously, this is quite a bit of hyperbole, and they do miss a few things in their discussion, but I think it is helpful to note that the term adrenal fatigue, not only is it not a medical term, but it does have some negative connotation. Even some publications, ironically, have tried to debunk, let's call it, adrenal fatigue, using, in this case, a systematic review saying it doesn't exist, or we are tired of adrenal fatigue. So within the broader community of research, the term adrenal fatigue is kind of viewed negatively. And I would say that we should just abandon the term altogether, because the idea that the adrenal glands, sort of peter out with their ability to produce cortisol as a phenomena for stress is really an inappropriate way to think about it. So I obviously, we want to talk about the adrenal gland when we talk about primary adrenal insufficiency. It's real, it's an autoimmune phenomenon primarily, but it's not a stress-related chronic disease phenomenon. So adrenal insufficiency or adrenal fatigue, when it comes to that definition, is very different. Obviously, it's related to extremely low or almost zero output of cortisol. However, stress-related changes in adrenal hormone output are regulated by the brain. They're not caused by fatigue or fatiguing of the adrenal gland to produce the hormone. So this phenomena, typically cortisol is produced in response to ACTH. When ACTH goes down, cortisol goes down. That's controlled by the hypothalamus and the pituitary, not the adrenal gland. Ironically, secondary and tertiary adrenal insufficiency is also a hypothalamic and pituitary issue and not an adrenal issue. So it would be great if those official terms were changed. But nonetheless, if you have anything that causes CRH to go down in the hypothalamus, or the pituitary reduces its ability to produce ACTH, which is classic in the case of giving somebody corticosteroid therapy, eventually you will get secondary or tertiary adrenal insufficiency, but that also is not a stress-induced phenomena, except perhaps under chronic stress long-term. So what I try to explain to clinicians is the adrenals respond to the brain. Obviously, there's feedback inhibition, which alters cortisol output. So there's obviously a crosstalk, as you guys well know, and a variety of stress signals from outside the hypothalamus, meaning outside the body and outside the hypothalamus within the body. So things that are coming like hypoglycemia, these kind of things, they are the ones that signal cortisol production. And obviously the adrenal gland itself doesn't decide what to do. So the feedback, this is the classic HPA axis, as you guys probably well know. The hypothalamus produces corticotropin releasing factor or hormone, CRF, CRH, which then triggers the anterior pituitary to produce corticotropin, ACTH, which then triggers the adrenal cortex to produce cortisol. And then you get this sort of standard feedback, and the pituitary and the hypothalamus then can gauge how much cortisol is in the system, how much free cortisol is available. But you have, in the case of people with major depression, they don't sense that in the pituitary and the hypothalamus. Their feedback inhibition is limited, and so therefore they will often increase the amount of CRH and ACTH, and often people with major depression have elevated cortisol levels. Whereas you have the opposite going on in adults with PTSD. Their feedback inhibition is more limited, and so, or I should say, it's hyperexpressed, and so they will sense the cortisol is being greater than it really is, and they will shut down corticotropin releasing factor, shut down ACTH, and they will have low cortisol levels. They will also often have high DHEA levels. So this is sort of one way the body protects itself from hypercortisolemia is by shutting down or being oversensitive to the cortisol feedback and then shutting down ACTH production. So this is sort of what we've all learned in the classic pathways. So when I'm talking about when that goes awry, I'm typically referring to this in a very generic sense. It's HPA axis dysfunction. We can call it a maladaptation to stress or a stress response dysfunction, or if you want to think about it from a real terminology, chronic stress can lead to an adaptation to stress with consequences. So typically when you downregulate the stress response, you become less able to deal with a new stressor. When it comes to specific terms, where these are appropriate, if you're measuring cortisol and it's low, I think using hypocortisolism, or when it's high, hypercortisolism is appropriate. Now you should realize that within the stress response world, hypo and hypercortisolism may mean something different than how endocrinology uses these terms for Cushing's and Addison's. So when you're in an environment where you're talking with endocrinologists, they might use those terms a little more, they might use them differently than you would use them if you're just measuring cortisol using saliva. So just be aware of that. If you're measuring DHEA or DHEA sulfate and it's low, that's what you define, and that's really how you could describe it. In the literature, we have all kinds of other terminology that is used, things like allostatic load, burnout, these kinds of things. And as we've learned over the years, the publications using these terms, they didn't always use the same definition. So you need to properly define those and kind of see what definition is used in the publication that is using, like say, burnout, for instance. Bruce McEwen coined this term allostatic load, and it kind of was meant to sort of give a new definition. We think of homeostasis, where everything stays the same. Well, we know that everything in the body doesn't stay the same. It's in this constant dynamic equilibrium. And so he termed allostatic load as a way to understand what is the cost of adaptation to the change. And so when you start thinking of allostatic load, the definition I use is the metabolic cost that a person needs to, or that the body needs to put into a system to reestablish physiological integrity after a stressor. So whatever the stressor is, It changes the equilibrium of the metabolism of the organism. How much cost? What is the metabolic cost to get us back to where we were before that stressor hit us? And so every time that happens, obviously, as those stressors grow up, and up, the metabolic cost continues to go up and up, and then the body begins to adapt to that. And that's why you have sort of a down regulation after a lot of stress or a lot of allostasis. So the stress response, if we just back up a little bit, obviously it's more than just cortisol. We have the autonomic nervous system, which produces from the adrenal medulla catecholamines, so epinephrine, norepinephrine. This is that classic fight or flight response, happens immediately. Whereas the HPA axis is a little more slow. It's really designed to be an energy management system, so it allows for the stress response to provide glucose, amino acids, fatty acids, whatever that's needed. Whereas the epinephrine, norepinephrine allows you to, in the next 5 minutes, are you going to survive? Where the HPA axis doesn't kick in until at least 10, 15, maybe the next several hours. So we have glucocorticoids like cortisol. DHEA is also part of the HPA axis, although slightly controlled differently. And then aldosterone as mineralocorticoid is also part of the larger HPA axis. And so a lot of other things that are going on in the stress response we need to consider. By the way, the norepinephrine system of the brain is separate from that which is in the adrenal gland, meaning if you had to wait for the norepinephrine produced in the adrenal gland to get back through the blood into the brain, you may already be dead. So the brain has the locus coeruleus norepinephrine system, so that when you have that immediate, like when you hear a sound and you're startled almost immediately, even before you hear the sound, your body reacts. That's because you have this immediate ability to produce norepinephrine in the brain, and that's actually what helps stimulate that original CRF response of the hypothalamus, among other things that go on in the brain. So this is another way of thinking about sort of another stress response system that isn't the HPA axis or even the adrenal gland. So there's a number of different things that I pointed out in the larger discussion, and one of them is when you produce cortisol, that's not the end of the game. Meaning, once you produce cortisol, it doesn't have an effect on every tissue. One of the many ways in which cortisol is modified is actually its conversion to the inactive cortisone. And so these are enzymes that are active in many different tissues. And you can see it's called 11-beta hydroxysteroid dehydrogenase. There's 2 different isomers. One of them, HSD1, converts the inactive form, cortisone, into the active cortisol in liver, adipose, even in the brain, a skeletal muscle, and sometimes in the immune system. And this is typically done in order to combat something that's going on, the reason that it needs cortisol. And as some literature suggests that up to 30% of the circulating cortisol in any given individual is produced by the adipose tissue converting cortisone to cortisol. However, there is the opposite, that is the inactivation of cortisol, and that's typically done in tissues where aldosterone manages water. So kidney, colon, sweat glands, saliva glands, and the placenta. And so when these are activated, they will prevent cortisol from coming in and sort of hijacking the mineralocorticoid receptor and triggering retention of water. And of course, if you're aware of glycyrrhizin, which is an active component of licorice actually inhibits that enzyme. And that's one of the reasons why people who are taking truly the black licorice candy that has actually truly licorice in it, not anise, you will get this secondary aldosterone effect, water retention. And in people with salt-sensitive who are salt-sensitive hypertensives, they may have a negative reaction to consuming too much licorice. And so typically licorice is sparing of low cortisol, but it can be problematic in people with elevated cortisol. So when I teach clinicians about the solutions for managing the HPA axis, I try to remove them from thinking about fixing the adrenal glands and ask them the question of what is influencing the HPA axis. So again, the HPA axis responds to homeostatic metabolic needs. So if I need energy, if I'm low in glucose, if I have inflammation, cortisol is going to help, quench that. if I have metabolic dysregulation of any kind, circadian disruptions, these are all things that are going to trigger the brain to have a stress response. But this is also a manager of anticipation of metabolic needs. So if I have a psychosocial stress, something that I'm thinking is going to be a problem, my HPA axis kicks in. The HPA axis is also helping regulate the circadian adaptation or anticipation of metabolic functions. So that's one of the reasons cortisol has such a diurnal rhythm, is because it is partly managing most of the metabolic regulation of the body that is circadian. And then the HPA axis also has to deal with all the adaptations from prior stress events. So whether that's early life stress, changes to cortisol sensitivity, the feedback loops like we mentioned, there's the production of chaperones, which are proteins that help the glucocorticoid receptor change over time, its interactions, neurosteroids. Actually, your brain makes pregnenolone and DHEA. It doesn't make cortisol, but it makes pregnenolone and DHEA, and those affect the influence of the brain. And then learned responses, how you learned how to deal with things in the past. All of these affect sort of how the brain responds. And so understanding that this is what's triggering your patient, these sorts of things, these are the sorts of areas that you need to begin investigating where the patient is struggling. And so this is a graphic that I designed to kind of show all of these things. You can see these 4 quadrants: circadian disruption, inflammatory signals, glycemic dysregulation. These 3 areas are those homeostatic signals that when they go awry, the HPA axis is going to respond to them. So they're responsive parts of the HPA axis. And then the upper left-hand quadrant, you have what I call life events that trigger the HPA axis. These are perceived stressors, and things that are new, things that are unpredictable, things that you feel are out of your control begin to create stressors. And these are anticipatory. These often can be things you see, but these are often things you're thinking about and how your body interprets what it's seeing outside of itself. So there are a lot of ways of measuring the HPA axis. We often measure cortisol, which is very important. But one of the things that I've been talking quite a bit about is the fact that when you measure cortisol in the morning, especially when you do time 0 and 30 minutes after awakening, you can capture something called the cortisol awakening response. And essentially what you do is not only do you get especially when you add this to the rest of the measures throughout the day, you not only get a circadian rhythm, but you get what is a provocation of waking. So it gives you a little bit of this idea of what is the plasticity or the reactivity of the HPA axis to waking. And if it's done appropriately, this can be a very helpful measurement. And I've been recommending that this is absolutely something that you need to add to a diurnal rhythm of cortisol. This can be done with saliva, and it really gives you, I think, one of the best, and if you look in the literature, it's one of the most frequently used biomarkers to connect cortisol with a stressor event. So if you don't know about the cortisol awakening response, something you really should be looking into. So I just want to kind of close out by just mentioning some of these factors. Hypoglycemia, if you have a patient who's regulating their blood sugar, let's say with the stress response, because they become hypoglycemic, then hyperglycemic because they're not managing their diet very well, it's going to drain it's going to put a lot of allostatic pressure on the HPA axis and really drain its ability to respond. Also, inflammatory signals, regardless of where they come from. TNF alpha, IL-6, IL-1 beta, which are the typical inflammatory cytokines, are strong triggers of the HPA axis. And one of those things that I think people often forget about is GI inflammation. So if you have a patient that has intestinal permeability, they've got dysbiosis or some sort of infection, lipopolysaccharide particularly be a very problematic trigger of inflammation. If you have reduced short chain fatty acids, so if you really changed sort of the dynamic of what the bacteria are producing that would support the immune system, or food antigens. All of these would be triggers for the immune system to produce IL-6, IL-1 beta, TNF alpha, And so this is a way that you can look at, if you're racking your brain of like, why is this patient's inflammation continuing to go, driving their cortisol levels, and oftentimes you'll see elevated cortisol levels in the evening with people that have gut inflammation. So it's just one of the many things that you should be looking at amongst, you know, a broad range of things to understand how something as simple as GI inflammation can affect their HPA axis. And once you affect the HPA axis, because it affects circadian rhythm and metabolism, it affects everything. So in thinking about what you can do, I do a lot of teaching on these sort of things, but I break up sort of the strategies for supporting HPA axis function in those things that support the brain and the CNS support. And you'll see most of those things are in maintaining those triggers. So reducing glycemic dysregulation, perceived stress, inflammation, improving circadian signaling. Maybe we can do something with neurosteroids, neurotransmitters, making sure these other things are there. You'll see on the right-hand side, you can manage how the body deals with cortisol. We mentioned quite a bit here, or I mentioned a little bit here about 11-beta HSD1. You can reduce the activity of that by reducing inflammation, reducing adiposity, physical activity, those kinds of things. You may be able to increase the chaperones that I mentioned briefly. Those might be able to be done by using adaptogenic herbs, giving somebody DHEA if they're low. And you'll notice in the middle, we have adrenal support. And I would say we know very little about how to support the adrenal gland, but you'll see typically that being done with vitamins and minerals, these kind of things. So most of the support is on the left side and the right side. And that's where I tell clinicians they really need to be thinking in their patients to deal with. So, and of course, those come from those stressors that I mentioned, those 4 quadrants of the stressors. So I want to thank you, and hopefully you'll be able to access some of my other information where I expand on these and a lot more. Thank you very much.